At one time, this empty valley was filled with 272 coke ovens and a shaft mine. Technically, this was Heckler No. 1, one of two mining and coke operations in a community with two names that we're about to talk about. The community of Hecla, which technically is known as Southwest according to the zip codes, was founded in 1882 along Boyer Run, which you see right below me. It was founded to be a community for the mining and coke operations of Faw and Dorsey Coal and Coke. Their initial operation was a shaft mine known as Heckler No. 1. And the name Hecla, there is dispute over where the name came from. Some say it is an abbreviation of the name Henry Clay Frick, whose company will later own the mine over there. However, since this was originally opened by Faw and Dorsey, I'm not sure about that. In either case, Hecla No. 1 was fueled by this reservoir over here, which is now used by the Hecla Sportsman Club. And this would have been needed primarily for the coke operations, for dousing the intense heat of baking the coal to coke, as well as at the time a lot of these operations were steam powered. All the gears and shafts bringing the elevators up, all the tooling, a lot of it steam powered, so you need water to be boiled for steam. There are actually two patch communities that make up what was the operation for Hecla No. 1. This one is on the eastern hillside coming in on Heckler Road. Pretty nice condition houses. Now keep in mind, for those not familiar with patch communities, especially in Pennsylvania, most of these were duplexes. I'm now on the western hillside in this Boyer Run Valley overlooking Heckler No. 1, and you can actually see the slag dump in the background. It's one of the few surviving slag dumps in Westmoreland County. Used to be dotting the whole landscape. But many of them are reclaimed, except this one, which is still as tall as it was when the operations closed. Now, Faw and Dorsey eventually renamed their whole operation Heckler Coke in 1889, and Heckler Coke actually opened a second operation a few miles up the road in Trauger, became known as Heckler No. 2. And then at the end of the 19th century, going into 20th, 1902, I remember the date now, 1902, Heckler Coke decided to create a second works right here in their namesake community. So it can get a bit confusing, but the town of Hecla is actually made up of Hecla No. 1 and Hecla No. 3. Hecla No. 3 was behind me on up this road here. This is Boyer Road. And right over here where you see the fire hall, yeah, right there's the fire hall. Right in this area, this was known as Goat Hill. This was the patch community for Hecla No. 3. So they stayed on the other side of the hill, on the other side of the run. So they were separate patches. Both communities were serviced by the same supply store, Union Supply, which was arguably the biggest chain in western Pennsylvania at the time. Union Supply would essentially be what is now Sheetz today to us. Union Supply was the main company store for what will be the buyout of Heckler Coke, H.C. Frick. It's hard to see, but we're actually looking at the back of the bank of coke ovens for Hecla No. 3. Some of them do survive right along Boyer Road today. However, they are on private property. There are a few websites with photographs of the ovens as they are today, and I'll link that in the description below. On the other side, going up the road this way, this what is now an empty field, that was the shaft for No. 3. And once H.C. Frick took over the property in 1906, they're going to do improvements to the works, add in early electricity to the site, upgrade the timber workings and the mines to make them relatively safe. I mean, this is H.C. Frick we're talking about, relatively safe. And eventually this tiny hollow, which at the start of the 19th century had nobody living here, by the early 20th century, 1,000 people would have been living between Hecla No. 1 and Hecla No. 3. Now what ultimately happened was, around the Great Depression, 1920s, H.C. Frick began dropping their production. In 1926, they actually only had 11 of the coke ovens operating out of Hecla No. 1. 1928, they shut down Hecla No. 3 entirely, and in 1929, Hecla No. 1 was shut down. Goat Hill, which right here, this would have been the main, again, patch community for Hecla No. 3, in 1934 was raised, so H.C. Frick didn't have to pay any taxes on it. And it is now the shooting range for the Slovak Club of Hecla. I believe this was added in the 1960s. I'm not certain on the date of this fire hall. And to respect property boundaries, I'm trying to keep my distance, but I can't help but noticing a relatively old, looks like from 1970s or 80s fire truck over there. I should point out that it's time that it seems like most of the population of Hecla, at least in the turn of the 20th century, was made up of Austrian, Hungarian, and Slovakian immigrants. I believe this actually would have been the right-of-way for the Pennsylvania Railroad. They had a southwest branch, some people call it today the Sweckley branch. One of its tongs, I guess you want to say, came down here to service the Heckler mines, and you can see the slag pile way in the distance. Came down through here, across Boyer Road, and yeah, you can definitely see there is still a grade going that direction into the Heckler No. 3 works. Now, I'm unsure if the Heckler Works were serviced by two separate spurs. Some say Heckler 3 was serviced by somebody from Mount Pleasant, and then Heckler No. 1 was serviced by the Sweckley branch. But I don't know, looking from here, it looks like it was all one continuous branch off of Sweckley down, I think, eventually Carpentertown and Mammoth. I'm not certain on that. And was a patch down without having a row of bosses looking down upon their workers, quite literally. Up here is what they actually called manager's row here in Hecla. I don't know if all of these are original manager buildings, but the row would have generally been these group of buildings on the very crest of the hill. We're currently passing what was originally the United Methodist Church for Hecla. Parts of it date back to 1881, so this is one of the older structures in the Patch community. 1994, it was reorganized as the Community Church of Hecla, as it still serves today. And this brings us to the tale of two cities, if you want to say. Everybody in the region calls this the community of Hecla, but as I believe there's already a Hecla out in eastern PA, the Postal Service decided to give the name Southwest PA for the community. So if you're going to try to mail anything to Hecla, Pennsylvania in Westmoreland County, make sure you're writing Southwest PA. And indeed, it's a little bit poetic, as I think this town represents what Southwest Pennsylvania truly was in the early 20th century. Behind me, up until 2014, would have been one of the older buildings in Hecla. This was the Hecla School building. It was a grade school put back here in the early 1900s. Let the car go by. School building put here in the early 1900s. I believe it went from, I think it was all grades initially. It was full school right here. And then in the 1950s or 60s, they dropped it just to 1 through 8th grade. And school ended here in 1978. All students in this region now go to the Mount Pleasant schools, not far from us. But it was a very impressive building. Photos should be flashing right now by it. It still is in relatively good condition. The community used it as a community center until the early 2000s, fell into a state of repair, and had to be forced to be demolished. Many different businesses have come and go in Hecla. We're taking a look at actually where several of them would have stood at one point. Of course, we've mentioned the Union Supply Company was right down there, or not right there by the intersection. And then, of course, there was a clothing store in the area. It was called Gatto's Clothing. And then there was this other store, which the structure is still surviving. This was at one point Zora's store and eventually became Physics store. Now, what made Hecla so special was not necessarily its coke and coal history, but rather what happened right here, what connected right here many years ago. This was known as Hecla Junction, and this was the epicenter, in a sense, of the West Penn Railway system. Now, this is not a railroad in the sense of the Pennsylvania Railroad. This was a streetcar system, a trolley system that stretched through much of rural western Pennsylvania. Back in the day, you know, a lot of these roads were not paved. They were inefficient to travel, so a lot of people did not own cars and such back then. They relied on the streetcars to take them to the major communities and back to these little patches. Initially, West Penn Railway began in 1904. Right along this road here would have been the main line. Go in that direction. You can go to Actually, you can see right here, part of the trace cuts through the yard here. Go in this direction, you go up to Greensburg, Pennsylvania, and go down that direction. You can go through Mount Pleasant, Connellsville, and eventually Uniontown, and you probably get a connection all the way to Brownsville. And then in 1914, the Latrobe addition was completed, and at this juncture, trolleys would transfer from the main line to the Latrobe subdivision, and you can go from here. There was a very large trestle that went over Boyer Run over there, and if you follow where the poles go, you can actually get a pretty good idea. You can actually see a bit of the cut in the mountain over there, where that Latrobe sub would have gone through the whole way up, about a dozen miles or so, eventually connecting, dead-ending in Latrobe, PA. So this was a very popular transfer point, especially for students coming out of the Heckler School, which I would be standing in if it was here. That dog's about to go off at me again. So we're going to try to do this. I apologize, I'm reading right off my notes. Very unprofessional of me, but I just learning the information like you are watching this video. What I want to talk about when I come out to these pasture communities is some of the people that lived here, these small stories that do become America's stories. One particular tragic story I read about was about a Karl Kozak. He came over from Slovakia, was born in 1858, immigrated over here, had married a Katharina Breyer, my apologies, Katharina Breyer, and they moved here to Hecla in their early 20s. Unfortunately, Katharina, she passed away here in childbirth in 1888, and Karl went back over to Slovakia, tried to find a new wife, ended up getting married again, and emigrated back over here to Pennsylvania, and he ended up working at the Moorwood Works, which I have talked about extensively. There was a big incident there involving Henry Clay Frick. Hopefully the thumbnail's appearing right now. Unfortunately, Karl got injured with a rock fall in the Moorwood mines in the early 1910s, and unfortunately the rest of his life he was unable to work. He died in 1927. There was another story I found interesting of a John S. DeZambo. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. He was the son of Austrian immigrants. His father was a miner here at Hecla, I believe Hecla #1 actually. And DeZambo began working in the mines at 11 years old. It's one of them tragic parts of history where, you know, no child labor laws back then, so kids worked whenever they were able to lift heavy weight. So he began working in the Hecla mines, as Sam did, at age 11, and then at age 18 or 19, he got drafted during the First World War, and he ended up serving in the Provost Guard throughout that conflict. He came back here, continued his work as a miner, and in older age, when he retired, became a pretty important figurehead here in the Hecla community. At one point, he was the scoutmaster, the first scoutmaster of a troop based out of Hecla. And there was another thing he was important of. He was one of the big sponsors of what you see behind me. This is the Heckler War Memorial. Now, this brings us to the story of the Derrick brothers. Part of the reason this war memorial was dedicated was during the start of the Second World War, something to boost the morale of the Hecla community. And it wasn't just done here. This is when the honor rolls began popping up all across the country in small communities to boost support for the war effort. DeZambo was the chairman of the committee that commissioned the original honor roll here in Hecla. That car go by. In that car. I'm trying to tell a story. It's okay. Now, the reason they wanted to commemorate an honor roll was in particular to an individual by the name of Joseph Derrick. Joseph Derrick was part of a large family here in Hecla, PA. Their father was a miner. Well, go figure. Joseph Derrick had just graduated from high school, Hearst High School, when he had, of course, saw the news of December 7th, the attack on Pearl Harbor. And in early January, he was one of the first in the area to enlist. He ended up getting into the Navy in January of 1942. Tragically, on March 15th, 1942, while he was aboard the USS Meredith, while it was on transport from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, going through the Panama Canal, there was a torpedo malfunction on board, and several people got hurt. Joseph Derrick, wounded by the shrapnel from the explosion, found a tourniquet. Instead of putting on himself, he put on another wounded sailor, saving that sailor's life. But Joseph sadly died because of his injuries. For his heroic acts that day, there was actually a destroyer escort named after him in the later half of the war, the USS Derrick. But this is not where the story of the Derricks end. This memorial, the honor roll, was dedicated October, November 1942. And as I said, the Zambo had a big part in getting this put, as well as other people in the community. I'm just naming a few names that stick in my brain. Derrick, Joseph, had two other brothers that were also in the military during the Second World War, Michael and John. Now, John Derrick ended up becoming a staff sergeant and ended up becoming part of 4th Division, 2nd Infantry. May have that backwards. There will be something in the comments below if I have it backwards. Anyways, John Derrick ended up becoming a staff sergeant in the infantry, and he was at D-Day. Tragically, on June 12, 1944, he himself was a casualty of war. He died in combat. His body was not located until November of 1944 in France by the other brother, Michael Derrick, who was also a staff sergeant. In fact, tragically, when they got word of the death of John Derrick, Michael had just come back to Hecla for leave. Michael would survive the conflict. As I mentioned, he did go over to France and located his brother's remains, and eventually John Derrick was reinterred in Arlington Cemetery in 1948. The honor roll starts with the Revolutionary War, so there were people living in the Hecla area back into the 18th century. Of course, the community was not official yet. And eventually we get to the Civil War. Several names there. Joshua Reynolds, not that Reynolds, not the greatest / worst Corps commander of the American Civil War. That's a little inside joke for you Civil War nerds. You'll notice a lot of Hearst here. The Hearst High School was in nearby Norvell, Pennsylvania. Moving to the Spanish-American War. Then we have World War I. And we're going to move down here. And then, of course, a lot for the Second World War. And, of course, here is Joseph Derrick, first from Hecla to be killed in action. Move down through. Oh, there's a Forbes name. Sure. And let's see if we can find the other Derrick on. There he is. John R. Derrick. And in fact, John Derrick was awarded a Bronze Star for his actions. He was possibly awarded in January of 1945. And then there's his brother Michael, who returned home safely from service. But a lot of people served from the Hecla region. Much of American history, especially history of the past 100 years or so, starts in these little out of the way places that seemingly today have no connections to the outside world, but they have very strong ties to, not in maybe a major scale will change the course of American history, but little itty bitty pieces. And without those little itty bitty pieces, you wouldn't have a big picture. That is going to do it for the community with two names, Hecla Southwest. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more of these Patchtown tours, let me know in the comments section below. And, well, I think that about does it for Hecla. We'll see you in our next stop, folks.